Le presento a Arun Muralidhar, es fundador de McCube Investment Technology y fundador y cliente CEO de Alpha Engine Global Investment Solutions. Se desempeña como asesor experto en el proyecto de mejora de los sistemas de inversión en el retiro del Foro Económico Mundial y en el Consejo Asesor de Retiro Estratégico para el Instituto de Inversiones y Riqueza, anteriormente INCA, para su designación como asesor de gestión de retiro. También es profesor adjunto de finanzas en la Universidad George Washington y fue académico en el Centro de Iniciativas para la Jubilación de la Universidad de Georgetown. Ha escrito extensamente sobre reforma de pensiones con el profesor Franco Modigliani, innovación financiera con el profesor Robert Merton y la asignación de activos y la gestión de moneda. Tiene un doctorado en economía gerencial de la Sloan School of Management y un bachelor de la Universidad de Wabash. Así que los voy a dejar para lo que es esta charla final con Arun Muralidhar, Selfies.
Muchas gracias. I apologize because my Spanish is not as good as yours, so if you don't mind, I'll speak in English. Thank you so much, first of all, to Paulina, Manuel, all the members of AIOS and IDB for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure and an honor to be here to speak to such a distinguished group. And I hope at the end of today's presentation, you get something more than just taking a photograph on your phone. The idea here, as we were making a joke about selfies, is we like to take selfies because it makes us feel good about ourselves, right? It gives us a memory of standing on the beach in Montevideo, sitting with our family, doing something fun. The idea behind selfies came because I was struggling to manage my own pension fund. And just to put it in context, I actually manage money for other people's pension funds. Okay, so I'm a professional money manager for other people's pension funds, yet my own defined contribution pension plan was a mess. And so the question was, how can I find a way to help myself? And out of this came this idea, which we call selfies, which fortunately, for being the last presentation, I get to pick up on all the ideas of the previous speakers and show you how we can actually make an interesting connection. The danger is I'm standing between you and drinks for the reception, so I'll try to make it quick. Just very quickly on my background, just so that you understand how I ended up coming up with the idea with selfies. I started my career at the World Bank, issuing bonds, much like Herman is doing now for the Uruguay. And then I moved to the pension fund of the World Bank, which at the time that I was there was a defined benefit pension plan. But as many of you in this room remember, the World Bank was telling all of you to privatize your social security system, which I thought was a terrible idea because I was struggling to manage the defined benefit pension plan of the World Bank with some of the smartest people in the world. And I was incredibly shocked that the World Bank staff was telling you that you should tell your affiliates that they can make these decisions on their own. So with Professor Modigliani, we wrote this book called Rethinking Pension Reform, where we argued that there were better ways to save Social Security than to go for full privatization for all countries. Privatization made sense for some countries, but it did not make sense for all the countries, and there was a better way to reform Social Security. That's not going to be the topic of today's discussion. If we want, we can talk about that later on as well. But we predicted 25 years ago that you were going to have the challenges that Jorge brought up. That is, defined contribution in countries like the member countries of the World Bank was not going to lead to a good outcome. The financial markets were not developed, people were not educated, the instruments did not exist, and they were based on bad finance theory, which I'll talk about a little bit as well. I stopped doing pension reform for 20 years because I was frustrated that nobody read our books. And about a few years ago, I was invited to help some of the American states in reforming their own pension systems, where they were trying to create defined contribution pension plans for people who are not covered by the typical system. So this is typically the lower income, uneducated people. And in going through all of the proposals that these states were considering, I realized that there was another book that needed to be written, and that's why I wrote 50 States of Gray. It's not an erotic thriller, so don't go and buy it. It's about boring pension issues. But it tries to show how the practice of pensions and the theory of pensions are so different that very often when academics make prescriptions for how to reform your system, it can lead to sometimes a bad outcome. Okay? So that's the backdrop to how we got here. The agenda for today's presentation is what all of you know, which is retirement security is a challenge around the world. So it's not just restricted to your countries. In the United States, we're going to have a retirement crisis. Australia is dealing with challenges. The UK has challenges as well. And the biggest problem, which I don't think I've heard today in a lot of detail, is that we've transferred the responsibility to individuals who are pretty much financially illiterate. And I argue that I have a PhD in finance, and if I cannot make good decisions for my DC plan, what chance does somebody have if they're working as a private, as a Uber driver or something, to decide what assets to pick, right? So I'll talk about that a little bit because there's some very interesting data on adult literacy that we need to take into consideration. Now, as Herman mentioned, sometimes when you're thinking about reforming pensions, you have to ask, what is the broader context in the economy in which this challenge is going to take place? And all your countries are also struggling to fund infrastructure. So there might be an interesting solution in the idea I present today that can attack two problems with one solution. And if we can do that, I think that'll be a good problem as well. So the solution we're going to suggest is that innovation can actually help you do this. Professor Merton likes to use the term finance science to solve social problems, and that's really what I'm going to try to do today. And this has some interesting implications for public finance, but it also has interesting implications for regulation of pension funds. So we'll talk about that to conclude, and then I'll open it up for questions as well. But I think in order for these kinds of solutions to happen, governments, as well as the development banks, have got to be creative. We cannot try to take the old model and keep applying it again and again because that's not working. We have to start thinking out of the box for new solutions as well. So let's just take a quick look, because I know the audience is made up of DB and DC systems. The problem we have, if you remember, the World Bank wrote an exceptionally good book in 1994 called The Looming Pension Crisis. They were giving people a heads up. And they identified that there were 3 pillars of pension support, and all of them were starting to have some problems. But the main focus of that book was that the pay-as-you-go defined benefit Social Security was going to have a challenge around the world. We had aging populations, we had insufficient savings, and therefore, the obligations of your countries were getting to be larger and larger. What that means is, at the end of the day, if your social security system has promised benefits more than it has the capacity to tax the people, there's only 2 ways to solve the problem: cut the benefits or raise the taxes. Typically, that's how people have thought of pay-as-you-go. And what Professor Modigliani and I argued is that that's a very myopic way to look at the problem. So the World Bank looked at pay-as-you-go defined benefit Social Security and said, let's change pay-as-you-go to contributions, let's change defined benefit to defined contributions, and let's get rid of Social Security. And they made a fundamental mistake because the only problem in that system was the method of funding. Pay-as-you-go as a method of funding Social Security defined benefit systems is a problem, no doubt about it. But you could have changed the method of funding to what we have now in the defined contribution systems and still retain the defined benefit if you designed it well. Okay? So that's what we argued. Sadly, nobody did it, not even the United States. And so you still have a problem in Social Security around the world. Right? As we've mentioned, and I think Jessica pointed this out as well, is in the old days, employers were willing to offer some kind of a pension benefit. But especially after the crash of the market in 2000, and then definitely after 2008, most of the companies decided we don't want to take that risk. We're good at making cars, we're good at making electrical gadgets, we know nothing about pensions, we want to get out of the business. And so today, around the world, very few companies are willing to offer defined benefit. So what we've done is now, the one primary area where people were given a guaranteed retirement has been taken out, and we're transferring that entirely to individual or collective defined contribution systems. And I'm going to show you the number of challenges that you have in this system guarantees that there will be a retirement crisis. There's no other way to end this problem unless we do something special, right? Why? Because we have financial illiteracy, we have increasing longevity, We have very low coverage rates. I think we've talked about in Colombia, 28% of the people are very often covered. You have a lot of people in the informal sector, and typically people have not saved enough for retirement, right? So we cannot ask this question, are we okay because we've transferred risk to individuals? So this is why I can guarantee a retirement crisis, because when you look at a defined contribution system, now what we were able to do in a defined benefit, which was to spread the risk over many generations, now you shrunk the window of making good decisions to one lifetime. And we know that financial markets in one lifetime can be terrible. Look at the Japanese, right? So now all of a sudden, by shrinking the window to one lifetime, you're concentrating the risk dramatically on what the markets do in that one lifetime. Now here's where it gets even more complicated, is there are three very complicated decisions that people have to make. One is how much to save. Two is what do I buy, how much of it do I buy, and how often do I rebalance? And this typically has been done using modern portfolio theory, and I'll show you why that's a terrible mistake as well. Right? And then finally, if we even get to having enough assets at the end of this period, the question is, how do I decumulate this? Or what annuity should I buy? The big problem is there's a time gap between when you start savings and when you start retiring. And I think Jessica pointed out, people are in the accumulation phase for 40 years and then decumulation for 20. How can we get people to actually start to think of that as one continuous sort of window, not break it up into a 60-year problem, which is first 40 years of something and then 20 years of another thing as well? And I'll talk about financial illiteracy as well. The final problem in the design of a lot of these systems is that in most cases you have many different entities that you have to participate with. So you go to one group for your investments, then you have to take your money to another group for your decumulation. That just adds cost, it adds complexity, and it makes this problem incredibly difficult. So this is why when Professor Modigliani and I, back in 1997, started to look at the reforms that were being implemented, we said it's guaranteed to have a problem, unless something innovative happens, which I don't think has happened to a dramatic effect. Because the problem was not only were the annuity markets not developed at that time, but annuities, even in the more developed markets, are not taken up, as you've heard people say, right? If the take-up rate of annuities is 6 to 8% in the developed world, that doesn't bode very well for trying to get a better experience in the developing countries as well. And the challenge with them is they're high cost, they're complex, they're very risky, and very often they're illiquid. We've heard other people talk about that, so I won't spend a lot of time. But Professor Modigliani called this the annuity puzzle, which is, from a pure theoretical perspective, buying an annuity makes obvious sense because you give up a fixed amount of money and you're guaranteed a stream of income, yet nobody buys it, right? So let's just take a look at some of the data on financial illiteracy. I don't know how many of you have seen this study, but if you haven't, you should take a look at it. What happened is the World Bank actually studied a number of countries around the world, and they asked them basically three really simple questions. The first question was, do you understand how compounding works? So the question could be as simple as you have $100, which pays 10% per year. At the end of 2 years, will you have more than 110 or more than 120? And most people got it wrong. The second question was to ask them, if there's 5% inflation, and you put your money in the bank and you get $104 at the end of the year, are you better off or not? And people got that wrong too. And then the last problem was they said you have a choice between investing in your company or the big stock market. Most people did not understand the benefit of diversification. Why is this an issue? Because in Latin America and the Caribbean, if you look at this chart, you have a lot of light blue colors, which means these are countries with relatively low levels of literacy. Which means people were not able to answer 2 out of these 3 questions correctly. And these are absolutely critical questions because compounding is what you're going to have to earn over 60 years. Inflation is critical if you want to maintain your standard of living. And forget about diversification, right? If you can't understand these basic concepts, how can you go and make your own pension decisions? As I said, even I have a PhD and I can't do half these calculations, right? So what it takes us back to, and I think some people, Olga talked about this a little bit in terms of what are the principles of designing a retirement system. Most of you who've done any class in economics have seen the famous life cycle hypothesis of Modigliani, which was to say that when people have a consumption that goes throughout their lives, and then they have income only up to their working lives, so income is that line, this is consumption, whatever they save must grow at a rate of interest so that on the date of retirement, you can decumulate it, right? So that everybody has seen the life cycle hypothesis, and the big question that came out of this life cycle hypothesis was, what is the rate of return you should earn out of your assets to be able to finance this consumption? What I'm going to argue is, maybe the danger was by focusing on the rate of return, a lot of what's happened in the finance practice has gone a little bit crazy. Because we should define retirement as a guaranteed income, right? So we want the guarantee. We want it in real terms, especially in countries with high inflation. We want to make sure that you preserve your pre-standard of living, pre-retirement standard of living. That is, you can't go from having a standard of living like this when you worked to suddenly starting your life very much below that in retirement. And then ideally, you want it to death, right? So if I redefine the goal of a pension in this way, then actually I can draw a slightly different chart of what is the goal that we're trying to achieve. And what this chart says is that we have 40 years from the time we're 25 to 65, in which we have no need to get any cash flow. But the day on which I reach 65, I want to start receiving, let's say in this case, 50,000 Colombian pesos, right? And I'm measuring this in real terms, so really all this looks like is a steady stream of cash flows. And I wish Professor Modigliani had added this chart to his original paper, because then we wouldn't have had a lot of modern portfolio theory that actually gets us into the wrong answer. Retirement is not about rates of return. Retirement is all about cash flows. So when I see reports of here's the rate of return of the pension funds in the US and America and Europe, I don't care. What I really care about is what degree of cash flows have you locked up as of the present moment? Alternatively, what is the funded status, right? What is the ratio of the assets to the liabilities? It's all about the cash flows. And this is how, when I started to think about this, I suddenly realized that this actually looks like a slightly different bond from what we've bought before. And wouldn't it be nice if somebody could issue this type of bond for me? And because I used to issue bonds for the World Bank, I know that a bond issuer can create any type of bond that the market wants. So if everybody in your country wants this kind of payoff profile, we know we have demand for this bond. And what Herman showed is that a very innovative Ministry of Finance can actually create the supply of that bond too. So this is what I'll talk about for the rest of the presentation. Right? So now let's take a look at one of the problems. Why do I attack finance theory? Finance theory is beautiful. Okay? The people deserve the Nobel Prizes for all the beautiful theories they gave us. But because they made some very silent assumptions, they've led us into bad investment products. Okay? So we've used finance theory badly in the retirement space to create all sorts of problems. Let's take a really simple example. During the privatization, I was working with a couple of regulators in Latin America, and basically we were forcing a lot of the affiliates to put 100% of their portfolios into government bonds. And the idea behind that was, in finance theory, the bond is considered to be the safe asset, because here, if you measure the volatility of the bond, in this case a T-bill, it looks like it's not moving a lot, and therefore it's preserving your wealth. Right? But if I look at it in terms of the annuity that it would buy me, this is actually now extremely volatile. Why? Because interest rates are moving dramatically. So even though the bond may look like it's going to give me back my 10,000 pesos that I put into it, the amount of income it's going to give me is just jumping all over the map. Right? And so here, where the other interesting implication is in the reports that are sent to people in the pension system. If you send them a report that shows them that their wealth is stable, the idea of putting a lot of bonds in the portfolio is that people would not panic if the market corrected. But what we were not telling them is that their retirement income was actually going to be bouncing all over the place. This is an absolutely critical point, because in America, we have these things called life cycle funds, where as you age, the portfolio goes from a lot in stocks to a lot in bonds. And the regulator in America has told people that if you buy that bond, you can never sue the company that issued you the bond. Even though, when you get to retirement, you could have close to zero in your account. This life cycle product guarantees neither a wealth amount or a retirement account, but because of bad regulation in America, by giving it safe harbor, about $2 trillion have gone into these instruments. So you can guarantee that there will be a crisis in America, because all these people will get to retirement. If they have a bad outcome, they cannot sue the company that was managing the assets badly. It's going to become a debt of the government anyhow. This was the argument that Professor Modigliani and I were making, was that if you move people into these bad instruments, when they retire poor, the government is going to have to bail them out regardless of what you decide. You may think you close the social security system, but if everybody's retiring on the streets and living on the streets, the government is going to bear the cost. So you just transferred the cost to the individual, which comes back to the government, which means higher taxes because the government doesn't have money of its own. Okay? So here's one of the challenges of finance theory is it picks the wrong goal of wealth, whereas the goal in retirement should be income. Let's take the second case. Even if you had an inflation-linked bond, right, which you would normally think could be the safe asset in a pension, let's look at the typical cash flows that you have. You put some money out today to buy the bond, and then it pays you the real coupon for 20 or 30 years. And then at the end of 30 years, you get the big principal back. If you're a 25-year-old person who bought this bond, there are two problems with this. Right? One is you're getting these coupons when you don't need them. So you've immediately got reinvestment risk. And the second big problem is you get this big fat principal payment well before you need it, and it's not even in the form in which you want it. So every bond that exists out there today is a risky bond and is completely unsuited for these types of pension requirements that we have, where the cash flow is what I need here. So even in countries like South Africa, where they have maturities of 50 years, it takes very complicated financial engineering to take these bonds and make it into the kind of retirement income people want. What does that mean? The cost goes up, it becomes illiquid, you cannot change your mind, there's no flexibility, you're just making money for the asset managers and the banks, and you're taking money away from the poor people. Right? This is Robin Hood in reverse. You're stealing from the poor, and you're giving it to rich guys like me. Right? I'm not rich, but I'm an asset manager, right? So here's the thing is, all these instruments that exist are very risky relative to what we want out of our pension systems. So here's what our idea was. And because I was issuing bonds for the World Bank is financing infrastructure in your country, so I have a good idea. My idea was very simple, that the governments or supranationals can issue new bonds. Now, the bond is only going to start paying at age 65. So there'll be a bond that starts for every year when people turn 65. So there'll be a bond that starts in 2019, there'll be a bond that starts in 2020 for the people who end up becoming 65. So you buy the bond on the day you become 65. Okay? Now, unlike the traditional coupons, here I want to tie the coupon maturity for the window in which it pays just to average life expectancy of the economy. And there's a very good reason for doing this, and I think Olga brought up the statistic, but maybe I think Daniel did too. When we look at the average life expectancy, the poor people have a life expectancy much less than the average. So if you can make the maturity of the bond equal to the life expectancy of the economy, the poor people, by buying this bond, are hedging their longevity risk. In a defined benefit system or in a collective system, there's a reverse transfer, as Manuel said, where the poor who die quickly are subsidizing the rich who live long lives, right? So collective DC is a terrible system because you're transferring wealth from the poor for the longevity risk hedging of the rich. The idea of this bond was, let's stop the coupons in 20 years so that the poor can buy the bond and manage their longevity risk. And I'll talk about how we can manage the rest of the longevity risk as well. Now, unlike the traditional bonds that we used to see in the market, where the coupon is quoted as 1 3/8 and 3/7 and all these crazy numbers, my idea was very simple. Why not just quote the bond as paying $5 real or 5,000 pesos real per year? Okay, so no more percentage. I want to get out of this modern portfolio theory expected return idea and focus on cash flows. And now look at what this simple adjustment does is if somebody says, my goal is to have 50,000 pesos per year, and the bond pays 5 pesos per year, the only calculation they have to make is that they have to make 10,000 bonds while they're working. Somehow they have to buy 10,000 of these bonds. If they're 55 and they have only 5,000 bonds, their statement is going to tell them, you've saved 25,000 pesos per year. That's all you're going to get. You better either save more if you want more, take more risk, or lower your expectation of what you're going to get in retirement. So now we change the goal to just the number of bonds people have to buy, because this is hopefully the mathematics that anybody who's been in high school or even in school can actually do. If you try to calculate the replacement rate and the expected return of the portfolio, that math is not secure enough or even robust enough for people to calculate. You have to make it into mathematics that the uneducated person can look at it and say, I need to buy 10,000 more because this is not enough money for me. So this is how we thought we can establish demand for the safe asset. My original idea was with two professors from Japan and Korea. The idea with Professor Merton was, if this bond is in real terms, what should be the coupon adjustment for the nominal adjustment? And he had written a very beautiful paper in 1984 about how the risk in retirement is not inflation, but it's standard of living. Okay? So standard of living is what we would basically index this bond to. And that's why we called it standard of living indexed, forward-starting, income-only securities. Okay? And I'll talk about standard of living in a second as well. Okay? So why does standard of living matter? There's an interesting survey here from ING where they asked the number of people who did not enjoy the standard of living that they had when they were working. And typically you can see that it's the developing countries where the standard of living in retirement is a lot worse than it is pre-retirement. But even in the developed world, this is a challenge, right? So just to quickly summarize what was the innovations that we are recommending, the cash flow from the bond should match the cash flow of the goal. Right? So if the retirement goal is cash flows from 65, let's make sure we do that. Let's not have any bullet repayments, just a steady cash flow. Let's do it in real amounts, not in coupons. Let's link it to standard of living. Let's make it forward starting and try to design it so that people can understand it. Now, in many countries, there's a desire to not have the government do this because the government doesn't want to be involved too much in the reforms. We can argue that the government may need to start the process because you are the safest issuer of an instrument in your own currency. Maybe the World Bank is similar. I used to issue bonds for the World Bank, and I issued the first ever Greek drachma bond, which opened up the Greek market. So maybe the IDB and the World Bank can issue a few of these, but first the government will have to also create the market before insurance companies can issue this bond as well. Uruguay, I just talked about this in detail. I'm not going to spend too much time because Rodrigo is going to do a more technical analysis. You can think of what what Uruguay did, as a version of selfies. I like to call the Uruguay bond the wise bond. It's wage index security. I really think it's a very wise bond because they indexed it to pension units. Even the principal repayment is amortized over 3 years, so they've kind of made it a little bit smoother. And it's got an immediate payment, whereas here we're somewhat forward starting. I stole this slide from Professor Mantilla because he did an estimate of what would selfies have done in Colombia against, say, investing in the stock market or even investing in the S&P 500, which many people have suggested is a good way to hedge the risk in Latin American countries. And it's quite interesting that over the period from 2003 to 2018, the selfies would have actually had a much more interesting rate of return than any of these other instruments. But this, again, is not the true perspective you should think about. The true perspective you should think about is actually it would have given people a much more stable retirement income than investing in those other instruments. Okay? Here's another chart from Korea. Professor Merton had done an analysis. And because per capita consumption is growing quite rapidly in the developing world, making sure that you manage standard of living risk becomes very critical, because you don't want your people retiring and then suddenly having to change their lifestyle because the economy has grown so much that they're actually having a standard of living that even the stock market might not be able to compensate for. So this is an example where per capita consumption or standard of living actually grew at a much faster rate than even a pretty developed stock market in a country that's now gone from developing to developed. Very quickly, I'm going to just recap who are the types of people who could use these instruments, and then we'll talk about why is it a good deal for governments too, before I talk about regulatory issues. So we anticipate that there are three types of individuals who could like these bonds. One is people who are uncovered by any system, whether it's public or private. In a way, they're buying a retirement income from the government through this bond, right? The second group of people could be those covered by a pension plan, but who are going to get a very small benefit. And I think this is going to be the case in most countries. I just wrote a paper on Portugal, where in Portugal, the OECD has just done a report. The projected replacement from Social Security is so low, people are going to have to save in a private account to supplement what they get if they want a good lifetime. And the third one could be people who are in a pension plan, but who have to make decisions about what to hold. This could be the safe asset for them to hold if they don't want to take market risk. Obviously, this could also be held by pension funds and insurance companies. And then later on, maybe next time around, we can talk about how you can create innovative products. And I know Daniel has done very good work on this, that guarantee people the income they want by a financial company intelligently balancing between stocks and bonds to guarantee people a retirement income. On the supply side, why is this a good deal for governments? I think the most important thing is it's going to reduce the likelihood of retirement poverty. Because if everybody ends up retiring poor because they either spent the lump sum that they got or the annuity was too expensive, the government is going to have to bail them out. So as Herman mentioned, sometimes you have to make a policy change because you anticipate the overall balance sheet risk of the government as well. The beauty of this bond is it can also help finance infrastructure projects. Again, one of the challenges for developing countries is how do you fund in local currency for the long term? And how do you get less dependent on borrowing in foreign currencies where whenever there's a crisis, all my pension fund clients take their money out of your markets? Here's where you can actually start to fund infrastructure, because in infrastructure, you have a big capital investment today, and then 15 years from now, the project makes money and it gets returned. That's the exact opposite cash flow for this bond. Now, there's a danger that the government issues this bond and spends the money badly, but at least the hope is that they do the right thing, so there is a possibility to do that as well. If the government has a value-added tax regime, then the government is hedged. Because the coupon is tied to the value-added tax, the revenues are connected to the value-added tax, the government has much better stable issuance and balance sheet management than in the traditional bond issuance. And this was a key point of what Uruguay had to experience, right? Is they issued a bond tied to wages so that when the revenue of the government was going up, the coupons would go up. If the revenue went down, the coupons would go down. It actually made the management of Uruguay's debt much more efficient. With selfies, if the country already has a value-added tax regime, they actually have a clear hedge. These are a couple of extra points. There's a danger that governments may want to actually issue too much of this. Because remember, you're getting the money today and you have to repay it 30 years from now. Which government doesn't want that deal? So this is where you need institutions like the IDB and the IMF to have restrictions on how much you can issue, because otherwise you're putting the debt to a future government. Okay? And I think it can help insurance companies lower their annuity costs in one of two ways. Either they can better hedge the liabilities that they want, or secondly, they could potentially even issue this, because this is nothing more than an annuity in a bond. It's a term annuity. It's not a life annuity. Let me just quickly touch upon this, which is I don't address longevity risk in this bond because I wanted to mainly focus on the low income and the poorer people. I think that's the more interesting challenge. Longevity tends to be a rich person's problem. Now, I've designed another bond which I call longevity indexed variable expiration bonds, which I can email to anybody if they're interested. It's a little bit more technical, but using the same principles, you can show how an innovative government can issue a bond that hedges longevity risk, but also has the government hedged. And why do we know this can happen? Because the government's revenue from each cohort is a function of longevity. As a cohort lives longer and longer, the government gets revenue for a longer period from their taxes. So the government, in the end, becomes the best issuer of any kind of longevity hedge, right? So there's a possibility to create another instrument that has that. There's a technical question which we'll discuss more tomorrow, which is how do you measure standard of living? And I've given a couple of choices, but we can talk about that in more detail tomorrow. And we'll talk about pricing selfies as well. Since most of you are regulators here, I wanted to keep one last slide for what are the implications for regulation. And here, clearly, in terms of regulation, we need an independent agency with authority. And I use the Netherlands as an example because the Dutch regulators are very, very aggressive. And I think Manuel has had experience there, unlike the US regulations. US regulations of pension funds are terrible. How do you know that? Because the funded status of US pension plans is 80%, which means for every dollar we have of obligations, US pension funds have 80 cents. Whereas in the Netherlands, it's 100%. So you need to empower the regulator to make sure that they have the authority. So in the Netherlands, the regulator can come into a pension fund, request an audit of anything. They can fire the staff of the pension fund. They can fire the board. They can change the asset allocation. They can cut the benefits. If the regulators don't have the authority, you cannot get good outcomes. I'm sorry, but that's just the reality of it, right? Here, the change is going to be quite interesting, and we've talked about writing a paper, is rather than focusing on the wealth that you get in your statement, you have to change the goal to retirement income. We've talked about sustainable and adequate and sufficient retirement income. That has got to be the goal of regulation, not wealth. And that, I think, is going to require a lot of changes. But when I get my Social Security statement from America, it only tells me what my income is going to be. It doesn't tell me what my accumulated balance is on a notional basis. All statements have got to become retirement income statements, otherwise we cannot change people's behavior away from the wealth idea, right? What is the role of intermediaries? We have to make sure that intermediaries are acting in the interests of individuals. And the beauty of selfies is if they buy this bond, we'll be able to make sure how much of the retirement income they've actually locked up. So if they're playing this game of a life cycle fund and they haven't locked up any retirement income, then you know that they're just trying to get the fees for asset management and they're not trying to protect their clients. So again, the fees are extremely high in a lot of these asset management operations, but if they don't guarantee an outcome, you have to ask the question, have we done correctly by the affiliates by paying these high fees for just a gamble on stock markets, right? And then, as I said, finally, we have to change the reporting. This is a point Professor Merton has been making for 10 years, that it should be much more focused about income, but also giving people advice on how they should be able to achieve a different goal. Should you save more, take more risk? If you don't have something like that in that interaction, you're never going to get good outcomes. So very quickly to summarize, the current trend is going to need us to innovate, and I think selfies is one idea. I don't think it's the only idea, but I think we have to try to create something completely different that tries to guarantee the cash flows that we want our people to earn, right? We want them to have a sufficient guaranteed retirement income, and in a way you can think of selfies as creating an individual defined benefit. Okay? I want you to think about that a little bit. There's no pooling, but you've defined the benefit because you now know the cash flows from having selfies. Even a defined contribution is not really classically a defined contribution because contributions can vary as well. Here you can actually make this into an individual DB if you plan it well. The main point is it can eliminate a lot of cost. Okay, I'm an asset manager. I know what the fees are that I charge. I only get paid money when I make money. I don't lose money when I lose money, right? So it's a one-sided decision. Selfies takes out the cost, risk, complexity, and illiquidity. Because if I decide to change my goal, I can go and buy more. Or if I want money today, I can sell it. You don't have that in the current structures as well. It's a very good deal for governments, and I think development banks should be doing this as well. IDB, World Bank, IFC are all issuing bonds in your countries. They should be thinking about creating bonds like this that can allow the market to develop and fund infrastructure as well. And then finally, as I said, it's good for individuals because you're trying to target people who cannot do calculation of inflation or compounding, but hopefully they can do basic division. Let's give them something that allows them to operate at their level of literacy. And with that, I'll stop because I've got to go tomorrow again. So hopefully you got something interesting out of this. Thank you very much.